Dansville is a very small town near the coast where my aunt and uncle live. Now mostly a spot for people driving through with their families or lost tourists looking for one of the waterfalls that showed up in an older issue of National Geographic at one point. But perhaps better than the waterfalls, this town's claim to fame is actually about the town next to it. It was an old abandoned place that got left behind after some of the larger cities incorporated and this one refused to join the road network. Then it became where people used to go film movies and then leave behind the sets, alone to rot. A very niche group of movie fans would track the place down for pictures of forgotten films. Now, I know this story is going to sound odd, but I do ask you to remain respectful of the old man who existed, since his life and struggle has to be worth something even after the many years since his passing. I was in high school back when I first heard of his story, and wanting to be a big shot journalist at one point, I wanted to explore it. I had already done stories on the mailman's retirement and the future of libraries once the internet came in. But some of the most interesting ones were of the missing lambs and the strange lights that Mrs. Hill would see from the side of her house late at night. With pictures and everything, I was able to get a headline image on the actual town newspaper, and then later it was picked up by the county. The answer to the lights was just gas. At least that's what the scientists said. But this one was different. A man, nameless at this time, still lived in the town where everyone had left. He would get groceries delivered once a week by car, where he would make a list of materials he needed to make repairs on his home, and although the poor man was getting older, nobody seemed to want to take care of him. He had no family, no friends, and he didn't seem to want to talk to anybody. Yet, he was an important person and pretty well known. That's what I wanted my story to be about, so I got a ride from the man at the grocery warehouse one day, and perhaps too hopeful, I also packed a tent, a sleeping bag, and a large bottle of water. I also carried 2 cans of raviolis in my school bag. I wanted to be able to spend the weekend there. I wanted to meet with this man, get his story, and publish it. Maybe he would finally get out of that town. Perhaps just get some help. Everyone around the school knew part of the story of the man in the haunted town, yet nobody could describe where he lived. I would be the first. I met up with the kind man with the truck already loaded with all sorts of prepackaged foods, soaps and chunks of spare wood pieces, bags that looked like pillows. They were stuffed to the top of whatever light material was inside. I thought he was joking when he said to meet him at 5 in the morning. We drove through Dansville and into the edge, the one labeled by the last hill before everything became flat and grassy, with the greenery slowly getting larger until it turned to trunks and then trees that surrounded the small 2-way road. And it seemed like it too was vanishing as it transformed into dirt and then gravel. Jim at that point rolled up his window and asked me to lock my door. Up ahead, the broken down sign of Frinton, the letters now being able to be read thanks to the parts of the sign that faded first. The grass growing through the asphalt now as we passed by the buildings, still intact, perhaps a broken window here and there. But I still felt nervous about going through the intersection without looking both ways, even though I wasn't driving. Jim, the driver who worked at the warehouse, had tried to make conversation with me early on, but we ran out of things to talk about or simply dived into the moment of going to a place, lost in time. We kept going through the main street and into another patch of trees where the buildings, houses now, were more spread apart. By the large oak tree was a corner house, slightly larger than the others. The area surrounding it had no grass growing into the sidewalks or the streets. I knew we had arrived. "There's no phone here, kid," Jim said as he stopped the car. "You saw how we got here, right? That's the way back." He then said that if I got past the wooded area, a car surely would see me and I could hitch a ride. And even though he was trying to be helpful, I couldn't stop thinking about that one word he said. If I got past the wooded area, I would be okay. I tried to forget about it as I helped him unload the bags and boxes to the porch of the old wooden house. Once we were finished, he knocked on the door 3 times, hard, and shot me one of those looks that asked if I was sure about what I was doing. Then he silently got back to the truck and drove away, his arm sticking out the window. It took about 2 minutes when I finally heard steps coming up to the door. I clearly remember being so nervous, even more nervous than when I interviewed the mayor or when they picked up the body of Tracy's mom from the edge of the river, and I was there to write a story on it. The old man opened the spring door and looked at me, asking if I was all right and how he could help me. I told him that I was a writer and that I wanted to do a story on him with all of the confidence I had. His entire demeanor changed right then. "The story," he said. "On me." "Why in heaven's name would you want to do that?" he asked with a chuckle. He then invited me in. His house was neatly decorated, although the stacks of newspapers on the center and dinner tables were out of place. He seemed to have things in order, generally. "Ben," he said. "Ben Gritsmore," as he stretched out his hand for a handshake before wiping off what looked like sawdust from his hands and trying again. I introduced myself and asked if I could help him bring in the stuff. He took a deep breath, knowing it would be a lot of work, and then looked down, nodding, while getting the energy to go outside and grab the bags. He said he needed to finish up a few things in the back and that I could wait for him for a bit while he came back, before interrupting himself to ask where I would be staying or if I would be getting picked up. I pointed to my backpack and he got the point, saying that he had 4 rooms in the place, that if I could shake off the dust on one of them, I could stay there. I remember wholeheartedly believing that I would be staying on the porch of a random house with my tent and sleeping bag, thinking it would somehow make a good story for the place itself, but I had never been camping and I didn't know what I was doing, so I was really happy to have agreed to it. Besides, from all of the stories heard about the town, I was not sure I would actually want to see it alone in the dark. And so the man and I moved everything inside by the kitchen counter, and he rushed back outside toward the backyard. Rumors said that this man, Ben, was a doll maker, and he would not make just any type of doll, but specialized replicas of children that had died. Some people said he started with the dolls for his own wife and daughter, while others said that the tale had a more sinister beginning. Stories that dated way back to when the town had people in it, who told and retold the story of the legend himself, the Dollmaker of Frinton. But with no more people to tell his tale, it would end up being just me, the one who had to have the accurate account of a story and share it to keep it alive. And I remember sitting there, watching as the sun went high up in the sky and then later came back down through the trees in front of me. I could hear the scratching sounds of sanding material coming from the backyard, with sudden breaks from the old man. I had already gone through a can of my food and a couple of sips of water by this point, with time flying by as I thought of the questions I would ask Ben and wondering how he would react to the rumors of him from the nearby towns. I was young, and if I could go back in time, I would have helped them get out. And I would have gotten out of there myself before nightfall. Part 2 of The Dollmaker is coming up right after this. Stay with me. Ben came around the house and toward the porch just as the sun had set. He walked straight to a large barrel on the side of the porch, and with another bucket, he took out some of the water and rinsed off his hands. He smiled nervously as he looked around and said, in a near whisper, that we should go inside. As soon as we got in, he shut the door and the 3 locks, before going around the windows and the side entrance to do the same thing. His house had electricity at one point. I could see the old television and lamps all over the place. But now, he seemed to get around with oil lamps and candles. like a trip back in time. I had my camera with me, but even back then, a piece of advice I heard from my teacher had been to watch out for photographing inside private spaces, so I held back the urge. The place smelled like dust, but was otherwise clean, and I watched as he opened up the bags we had brought him and he made 2 sandwiches, bologna and mayo that he got from a small packet on 2 slices of white bread. He quickly walked over to the chair next to mine and sat down, taking a big bite out of his food. That was my chance. I asked him about himself. His family and everything was going well until I asked him why he lived alone in a town with no people. "There are no people here," he said. "But I'm not alone." If the man was talking about his dolls keeping him company, I knew that this story would be too much for me and that I would need to find another angle to it or be very cautious with a person like that. One never knows what to expect. He changed the subject upon probably realizing that I was uncomfortable with everything. Then he told me about one of his sons who was helping support him with the deliveries and that he would come by every once in a while to help out with projects here and there. He went on for a while about himself and then talked about the things he would eat and how he gets his water, and then he mentioned how the town used to be, before pausing and then quickly changing the subject again. "Mr. Gritsmore," I asked, "I'm here to do a story about you as the last resident here and your life. What do you do all day?" "Oh, well, I make dolls," he said. "Everyone knows that. They've been photographed and I've told their stories hundreds of times throughout the years," he continued. It turns out this man had been making them for almost 50 years. 20 or so of those years had been all by himself in the town. He pretty much watched it die. And if anyone knew the story of Frinton, it would be him. But as I dug deeper into his knowledge of the town itself, I found more questions than answers. He said that it was a very old town, with certain areas dating back hundreds of years as one of the first settlements. He spoke of the major historic events and plagues and other difficulties of the people of the town. The place itself was a testament to the survival of human civilization, he continued, exaggerating sentences with his hands as he spoke. He spoke of the elections for mayor, the people who made it out of town for bigger things who later returned to settle back in and live out their years. And then, just like that, the smile went away from his face. "Everything was good until it wasn't," he said. I need to first explain that this story was never written for the school newspaper, and in fact, it never saw the light of day in anything. What I heard there was so bizarre and personal that I decided to keep it to myself as a form of tribute to Ben, but at the time I guess I had my doubts that maybe I just didn't want to damage my own reputation. Plus, Ben cared for the town so much that he died with it. And who knows of the many secrets that would be at risk of being discovered because of uninvited guests looking for a thrill, completely ignoring the actual events and just following a blind story written by a high school kid. Ben stood up and went over to the back of the house, to a sort of second living room he had back there, to grab a crate. I could see the black hair coming out from the sides of it as he pulled out a doll with both hands, large, about the size of an actual 4 or 5-year-old child, and then set it on the floor. I was in awe of the thing. I walked over to it to look at its face, glassy brown eyes that sparkled with the light of the oil lamps from the other room. Its cheek, imperfect like that of a real human face, blemishes on the skin, along with its dead expression. The doll was wearing a blue dress, poorly sewn together with white cloth around the neck. I looked over to Ben, who, instead of being proud to display his creation, looked tired and solemn, a look more appropriate for a funeral. He explained that the dolls are what he makes, going into details on materials like wood and wax and composite, natural hair and cloth from actual dresses. Days are spent sometimes on the faces and hands whenever he has a solid reference for them. But what surprised me the most was that each one was said to be completely unique. And I mean, sure, I thought he must have meant unique as in he would not be able to accomplish the same level of detail on every single one. But he expanded on it. Each one had a name, a last name, and was of a certain age. I was intrigued. If this really was the case, the people of my town and the surrounding places had a reason to start rumors about the guy and his strange obsession. I figured I would tell him about the rumors at that moment, and risking getting kicked out into the darkness of a dead town. I told him. I said that the people talked about him, and in not the most positive light. That he was a creep who liked to live by himself and that he had mental problems that would not let him join a serious society. He looked at me and smiled, making sure that I was not going to say anything else before he started talking. Kid, you're not the first person to tell me that, you know. I looked at him, waiting for him to continue. Again, another tip from my journalism teacher. I wish I would have said something, though. Changed the subject, or I don't know, talked about his family again. But then he explained it. In the early times of the town, stories were collected of a particular family who was not welcomed by the rest of the townsfolk, and that through every generation, the plot of the land that they had would be seized or swapped for a larger piece, with the condition that it would be farther away from the center of town. The family would usually agree to the offer easily. It was hard to refuse more land. They were able to keep it civil for some time until one of the family members' husband passed away and was left alone to fend for herself against a town that did not want her there. Eventually, though, peculiar events started happening around the town, like things with the clock tower being witnessed by several people to be moving backwards. The time when thousands of rats arrived and destroyed wooden columns and the entire bakery. The event labeled on a wall at the tiny library, he said, that talked about the birds that stopped in place in the sky, or the time the large white owl stood on a branch on the center square for over 2 days straight. The townspeople had gathered around the church and at the courts to talk about what had been happening, before deciding to do nothing because the events were simply peculiar things. Suggestions that they were evil would seem too silly to go on the public records, and so they decided to leave it at that. Suspicions had already grown about Bertha, the widow, being responsible for all of this, but nobody had any proof, and so she remained by herself at the edge of town. Eventually, the events escalated. Children were disappearing from the market, from the play areas, and some snatched in the middle of the night right from their beds. Siblings, little kids would sometimes have to testify about the disappearances, saying that they saw a woman come in through the window and take their little brother or sister by the leg and then drag them straight out. All this time, I was looking at Ben's expression to see if he would suddenly smile or admit to be joking around, but he only kept getting more and more upset at his own memories. Eventually, families started leaving the town. Everyone from the church people to the elected officials. And then hundreds of children over the years disappeared from Frinton and other nearby towns. Stories circulated about the widow searching for children to bring back to her house. But that part, Ben assured, was real. And he demanded for it to be added to my story. I looked at him right in the eye when he asked me if I believed him. My journalism teacher never taught me what to say in such a case, so I just said my truth. The story was hard to believe. It's important to mention that eventually I did find records of the disappearances. But what about the dolls, you may ask? Who were they for and why did he spend so much time on them? Ben's enthusiasm for answering the questions went away right then, and Even today, I consider the way I answered his question to be one of my biggest mistakes. He was still very polite when he answered the process of making his dolls out of photographs that were sent to him. Every detail had to be right for them to be taken, he explained. Everything from the shape to the weight and the color of the hair were spot on, always. And I believed him. The doll he had made that evening was just so realistic. Before the conversation died out, I asked again, after building some rapport with him, why he did what he did. The man simply stared at the lamp about to die out, and then, in silence, he took a deep breath and then said, "More children will not go missing." When I think back on that conversation, I am not sure Ben knew if what he was doing would work. But there's little left to say when you're sitting next to a sobbing old man. I was looking for an answer that was not there. Perhaps the guy only did what he was told, and had done so for so long that it was all he knew, getting better with every doll that he made for no reason at all. There were no kids left in what remained in that town, unless he meant kids from other places. Ben showed me the room where I would be staying and immediately walked over to the window and then pressed on the latch to make sure that it was closed. I heard him walk around the house to the other rooms to wiggle the doors and windows. The bed sheets were cold when I got into bed with my sleeping bag. It was sometime around 3 a.m. when I heard footsteps from the porch, just around the corner from where my bedroom was. Everything was silent for a bit. The window had no curtains, and the blue light from the moon was shining straight to my face when I turned toward it. I waited for another creak, the kind you expect to hear when you lift your foot from the floor. There was nothing. And that's when I saw the face of the doll. The same doll from earlier that day, right against the glass. It sank down toward the sill, very slowly, until behind it, I got to see the face of an old woman, as she smiled and then tapped on the glass, and then signaled for me to open it. I pulled up the sleeping bag over my eyes and waited for her to go away, but all I could hear were the chuckles. After a few seconds, I heard the footsteps through the porch and then the grass and the gravel as she walked away, making her way through the town once again. You can also listen to the stories ad-free on Scary Plus by going to scaryplus.com, or information is also available right on your Apple Podcasts app. But remember, the stories will always be available for everyone right here. If you want to get in touch to share something creepy, you can also find me on Instagram, or you can reach the team via email. More content is available on our other shows from Scary FM. Thank you very much for listening. See you soon.